one of the things when it comes the second week of July that it's kind of become a family tradition for us is that we go over to Okemah to the Woody Guthrie Festival. And it starts usually on Wednesday. We didn't get there until Thursday. And always in the past, because when we were at Prague, it was just a 20-minute drive. We'd drive back and forth from home. And this year we decided we were actually going to go and camp out. And what we found out is that there's just a whole group of people who love folk music that travel and go to these different kind of festivals as they pop up. And they all come out there and you know, from the tie-dyed hippies to the kind of ones that are more country and western in style and to the Appalachian type music. I mean, it was just a lot of fun. And then you go to hear all the different venues. And of course, Woody Guthrie has his own take on, and as an Okie, it's something I have a deep appreciation for. And we had a great time, and then I saw the T-shirt for this year, and I knew that the scripture for today was the parable of the sower, so I decided I had to buy the T-shirt and wear it this morning, you know. And so it shows them sowing, and then, you know, putting the seed down, and it turns into music. So, you know, kind of the red dirt of our Oklahoma background. And you know, just love all the music and more than you could even imagine. You know, the first night, all the different bands, and we end up with closing it out about 12 o'clock, everybody singing, you know, kind of Pete Seeger style, all the singers coming up front and singing "This Land Is Your Land," you know, Woody Guthrie's anthem for the country. And you know, beautiful song. We thought that was closing out the evening until we got to the campground. And there we got to the campground, and Angie and the kids were kind of figuring out where everybody was sleeping. It's about 12:30, and all of a sudden, this guy coming up carrying one of those big upright basses. He comes walking up, and behind him is another person with a banjo and a mandolin and guitar. And they said, "Well, here's somebody. Well, let's just sing him a song." And so they started, and I called Angie and the kids out, and that was at 12:30. And at 3 o'clock, we stopped singing. You know, Thomas got his guitar, I got my guitar out, and Anna would sing, and we all were playing and singing, just and other folks coming up, a nice time. And it was pretty late, though. And so we left last night. We got in the house about 1 o'clock this morning, and then got up at 5 to come make sure I was all ready for here, and then we're going to go back out and pick the camper up and come back in later today. So anyway, y'all didn't want to hear all that, but it was a lot of fun. I guess I've got the microphone, so I can talk about whatever I want. But one of the things I love about Red Dirt music is that it talks about our roots, about who we are and where we have come from, knowing that that where we come from is someplace, and it's someplace that has value and it has importance. If you don't know who you are and where you come from, it's hard to ever know where it is you're going if you do not have an appreciation for your roots. And one of the things I remember telling you guys right after I came, I think I've hit this a third time. Is that the next image? Okay. No, that's got to be one too far. There we go. That's the one. That's the one I want. Okay. But you got to know your roots. And I grew up in South Oklahoma City. And many of you, you've been around Oklahoma City, you know this already. If you haven't been, you know, this will be a little bit of news to you. But those who live in South Oklahoma City always have a little bit of a complex about Oklahoma City. You know, North Oklahoma City is Oklahoma City. People sometimes will kind of think of it. South Oklahoma City is just that other side of town, south of the river. And so you kind of carry a bit of a chip on your shoulder when you come out of Capitol Hill. And I remember whenever I was an adjunct professor at OCU, and there's all these other folks there, and the dean of the school of a business school was there, and we were visiting, and I didn't realize it, but he came out of Capitol Hill, grew up in Capitol Hill, and so we immediately had that connection. Southsiders kind of feel that bond, you know. It's the way Okies see and feel whenever you run into another Okie somewhere. And so we had that, and so he was about my dad's age, and we were talking, and he asked where my dad grew up, and I told him. He said, well, he didn't just grow up on the wrong side of the river. He grew up on the wrong side of the tracks, too. And wasn't southwest Oklahoma City. He was southeast Oklahoma City. And, you know, in his lifetime, he managed to move across the tracks. And in my lifetime, I think I probably managed to move across the river as well, although maybe where I feel most comfortable is back with my feet deeply planted in the roots of South Oklahoma City. I think Chickasha feels that way to me. There's something similar about Chickasha in South Oklahoma City, and to me, I feel at home here. It feels perfectly at home. If you don't know who you are, if you don't know your roots, it's difficult to ever be able to move forward. Carl Jung, a student of Freud, and I think in many ways spoke to the human spirit much more deeply. He said, if the world will ask you who you are, and if you do not answer, it will tell you. Knowing your roots is knowing who you are, and not having the world tell you who you are. And part of our roots are who we are growing up and who we are in terms of place. But more deeply, they are who we are in Christ. It's our spiritual roots that give us the depth of who we are, that give us our identity, our purpose. Understanding that we are God's makes all the difference in the world in terms of how we live and the values we hold, because we know who we are. Our kids growing up, and the programming that we do over here with the kids, they're learning the stories of faith. They're learning them deep, the way that we did when we were growing up, singing the songs that taught us Scripture. They taught us our identity in who God is in our lives. It's important for us to know and to hold, to let them be so deep within our lives. Several years ago, I was doing some consulting with they would call themselves a very liberal United Methodist church. And I was going and talking to him, and we were going through some of the church's history, and someone spoke up to me, and he had a very insightful thing. He said, you know, we grew up in conservative Methodist families, and we knew that there was a lot of push against that, and we found a different place and different way for us to be, and we wanted our kids to grow up free of some of the guilt that we grew up with, and some of the trappings of faith that they had experienced in their lives. He says, but what we found out is that we didn't give them something strong enough to push against. And when they all grew up in the church, they all just left. They didn't have deep enough roots. They didn't have something strong enough to hold on to be able to push against sometimes. One of the things I think, I just remember as a kid wrestling with my dad. And part of that is about pushing against something stronger than you are, harder than you are, to be able to kind of test your own strength. And our faith needs to be like that for us, like a pillar that we can push against and challenge ourselves against to develop our strength. And unless we have that deep within us, we lack the fortitude to be able to push through whenever times get difficult. Some of the seed landed on the shallow soil and sprung up fast, but because they had no depth of roots, they burned up in the sun. It's easy to do. It happens all the time. Folks get excited, and their faith grows, and yet it's growing outwardly this way, but not inwardly and spiritually deeper. And so it goes for a little while, and then it falls back until it even sometimes gets burned out in the sun. We've experienced it a time or two, maybe in our own lives. We've seen it in the lives of others sometimes. And I think it's not about judgment. It's not about judgment that these folks are too shallow. That's what I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that in the whole life of the church, what we need to do is be about giving people the depth of soil that they can grow deep roots and not have these flashes of growth in faith that aren't sustained by the root that can nourish and give it life more fully and completely. Sometimes even when the resources are there, it doesn't happen. In the life of our church this last year, we had a young man who joined the church, and he was real excited, and he had gotten involved and connected, and joined the congregation. And I'll leave the names out of this, but whenever he came up to join, a member of our congregation happened to notice that there was a warrant out for his arrest. And he then called another member of our church who's in the legal system and asked, what do we do? And they called me, and then I called him, and we sat down and we talked. And that one part of faith is that we deal with the things that we need to in our past. And so we set up a court date and went and took care of what needed to be taken care of, and continued on in faith for a while, but he couldn't establish the depth of root that was needed, and soon withered. And I don't think those seeds ever go away completely. Those seeds of faith, I think he still carries with him. Unfortunately, it's just not with us right now. And maybe there'll be a time whenever those seeds become watered again, and it can grow again, and he can say, you know, there was a time in my life when I was first starting that journey, and I fell away from it, fell back into patterns and routines of the past, and now maybe it will be nourished again in his life. I sure hope so. All we can be responsible is to be faithful to who we are and what God has called us to be right now as we minister and care for those who are in our flock and in this community. We need to be able to know that there's no end to God's planting seed. And isn't it amazing in the scripture? I mean, God just seems to throw seed indiscriminately. It just goes everywhere. And maybe that tells us something about God's nature, that God's not stingy about planting seed. God's planting seeds everywhere. And there are places where life will choose to grow that maybe we have not seen that it was fertile soil, and yet it is. Some of the seed fell on the shallow soil and had no root. And it's where we as a church need to help provide the depth of root for others. Some landed on the path. Let's try back to I guess I got them out of order somehow. Some fell on the path. And those that fell on the path were soon plucked up and eaten. And it's easy for us in our lives to sometimes kind of miss on the soil that's there. The seeds that landed on the path, where the soil was smooth and compacted because of the traffic, were carried away by the birds of the air. And in our lives, one of the things that we need to have are routines. We need to have routines that provide a path for us in life. They're not always places of deep spiritual growth. You know, you don't want a lot of things growing on the path, do you? The path is really for another purpose. The path is allowing us to travel the places that we need to move and to go. And the seed that lands there is kind of like, I think in our lives, the routines that we set up that allow us to move to deeper places of faith. You know, a 30-minute walk in the morning or run in the morning can create a whole new experience for the rest of the day. It shapes the rest of the day, a simple routine. 5 minutes, 10 minutes spent reading the upper room and time in prayer at the beginning of the day. Creates a routine that moves us through spiritually. It's the routine, the ritual, that helps us to stay connected in our faith. Routines and rituals help us to do that. When they become too much, then we call it a rut. Whenever a routine or a ritual has been traveled too many times without much thinking, it becomes a rut. And it's easy to become stuck in a rut, isn't it? It just becomes over and over and over again, not attending to the spiritual depth of it, just doing what we're called to do, but maybe not allowing there to be a great experience that follows with it. Routines and rituals, yes, but ruts, no. It's not what we're called to do and to be. It's an important part of our life. I had a close friend in the second congregation that I served. His name was Steve. Came to the church by way of his family. Mary Lee was his mother-in-law. It was one of those amazing, she was an evangelist and she didn't know it. Mary Lee came one Sunday and she sat, I remember, it would be on this side toward the front or the center pew, but way toward the back, and she sat by herself. The next week she came and she brought her two granddaughters, Lauren and Elizabeth. And Lauren and Elizabeth started coming with her every Sunday. Soon somebody invited them to Sunday school, and she started coming to Sunday school, and her kids started coming to Sunday school. And after a couple of months, then Pam and Steve, the parents, started coming. Mary Lee's daughter and son-in-law. And they got involved in the church. They became really close friends because their kids were the same age as ours, and we just ended up doing several things together. And Steve and I particularly hit it off. And the thing I didn't know until a little later, and he began to tell me, is that he always struggled with addiction in his life. And he would talk about from being a workaholic to alcohol, other things. And as he struggled with that in his life, he would find that those became ruts that didn't allow him to really grow in the fullness of his life. And yet, the thing that he found that was most meaningful to him in finding his way was a routine. It was a ritual of attending worship. And I always knew when I hadn't seen Steve in worship for a little while that things might not be going real well. I remember the day he came to my office and we sat down and he said, "Scott, I've made more money this month than I've ever made. And the month before were really good ones too. And things are going well in terms of business. But my family life is off track. My spiritual life is off track. Things are not going the way I want personally. Got more money than I've ever made. But life is not where I want it to be." He said, "I don't know how to explain it, but somehow when I get myself to worship each Sunday, it puts me in a place where I'm able to make it, and our family is able, it's just that little bit extra that helps to make family life seem to work a little easier." And it's the way in which he's in touch with God and feels the spiritual presence that uplifts him and allows him to move through. Maybe you've experienced that in your life as well. For 4 years as his pastor, we worked through those kinds of things. And what was, again, amazing about Mary Lee is that it didn't stop after Pam and Steve, but she started bringing her sister, Dorothy, and then her husband, who, when you know some of the patterns of addiction, her husband, who was an alcoholic as well, came and began worshiping. Don did in the life of that church. And it soon, you just didn't have, one pew didn't hold the whole family as she brought them in one by one to help them find what was needed in their lives. Steve became a person who's deep in his faith and yet always had to struggle with keeping his life on track. Several years later, I had moved on, and unfortunately, they had dropped out and disconnected with church. And you can probably guess how that led for Steve. it meant that while his daughters were in high school, he committed suicide. And lacking a church family to be around him, they were semi-connected, but not strongly. And they called me to do Steve's service, and we did it, and about 800 people who were there. And Steve, I told him there, he always knew the struggle that he faced in his life. And he always knew that if he depended upon God, he was able to make it through. And I'm so glad that he had come to a place of faith and understood God's place in his life, and that he was able to carry that through it. Unfortunately, he didn't end his life there. He ended it in the valley, and that's how it is for us often. But God didn't give up on him then. He gave up on himself. He had gone the course as far as he could, but God is even present there, even present in redeeming him back to God's self. With that family through a lot of their struggles, I wish I hadn't been, because if I hadn't, it would mean they were connected to a local church and things were going well. But even to the point where a few years ago, Pam called me up and she said, "I've met somebody, and would you do the wedding?" And so they in their kind of typical family pattern, they rented a party bus from Oklahoma City and drove all the way out to Prague to have the service there, and we had their wedding, and it was a kind of a beautiful time to reconnect. But I hope they're doing well. But sometimes if we don't keep ourselves in the ritual, in the routines of faith, we can find ourselves lost in the ruts that can be developed and the patterns that can overwhelm us in our lives. One of the ways that we help do that is just having our routine, our ritual. Remember a fella who had said, whenever I was young, I would come home and I would say, "Boys, it's Dad." And after the boys had grown up, I would come home and I would say, "Judy, your husband is home." He says, "Unfortunately, we lost Judy, so now when I come home, it's Bandit, here's Bob." And we can laugh about it, but he kept his routine, and it was something that allowed him to make his way through, to continue on. And that's one of the things that we rely on in our faith, that our faith gives us the routine to be able to continue. The third batch are the ones about relationships. The third batch of seed has a short life because of the company they keep. There's nothing wrong with the soil. It just supports a fine crop of thorns as well. And in our lives, it's easy to get choked out by the thorns. It's easy to get choked out by all the other stuff that will grow up around us. Consumerism, so many things that can choke out our lives. Thorns that develop in our relationships. In our relationships, they're tricky. We can't live without them, but sometimes it's hard to live with them. It's on days like whenever you and your spouse are fighting, and when the kids hate you, and when your coworkers mistrust you, and even the guy bagging your groceries at the store gives you a dirty look. The possibilities of a hermit life look pretty appealing. Just not have to deal with people. I remember a person coming to me, and they were complaining about someone else in the church that was doing something they didn't like. And I said, "Yeah, didn't it always bother you that whenever other people in the church do things you don't like in ways that are different than yours?" And I said, "I guess the easiest thing, would be just have a church of your own, and then you'd never have any disagreements with anybody, right?" The problem with the church is that there are people at the church. And when you deal with people, you deal with other agendas, and you have to figure out compromise. And it'd be easier just to forget all that and just, do your own thing. Remember the story about the fellow who was found on a deserted island, living all by himself on the island? And when they found him, they came, and they had 3 buildings there. And they asked him about the first one. He said, "Well, this is my home. This is where I I live. And they said, well, what's the next one? He says, well, that's my church. That's where I go to worship. And that's neat. Well, what's that other one? He said, well, that's the church I used to go to. And you know, it's easier just to find a new way, go find the new one, rather than to deal with people and to deal with relationships, because that's hard. It's hard because we disagree. We see things differently, from from color of the carpet, what songs we should sing, to for political views, to when Sunday school should be. I mean, you can create a long list of disagreements. And if you want to be disagreeable, you can be disagreeable. But the truth is, whenever relationships are not about that, when relationships are about building one another up, about seeing past, let's move to that next image on there. Thanks, Chris. When relationships are about strengthening one another, then we don't get hung up on the little details of disagreement. We don't get hung up on things that would hold us back as a church. We're there about building one another up and strengthen each other in faith. It becomes a way that we protect tender growth so that it can find a place to grow up. Sometimes it's in that tender time when a plant's growing up, that seeds, whenever weeds can choke it out easily. Weeds will choke out any good growth when it's young. It's then especially we got to protect it. I think new people, new Christians in faith ought to be protected by the congregation with a jealousy about their life. Here's one of our young ones. Let's take care of them. Let's, Jay, be on your best behavior. Not that Jay's, but we make sure that we're all on our best behavior around the young ones, those who are new in faith, so that we can raise them up. And then when they have the strength, we can let them fight it out over the, colors of paint and all those kinds of things in the church we want to fight about sometimes. Whenever we tend to life and relationships well, it's there that we find, like a good garden, you have companion planting. Some plants like to grow tall, and so you always plant in front of the tall ones that grow shorter. It's how you have good companion plants and how they grow with one another. We are hopelessly or hopefully tied to one another in our lives. There's no way around it. And if we find relationships to be things that tear us down, then we are hopelessly tied to one another. And when we find that relationships are that which build each other up, then we are hopefully tied to one another. In the early church, they didn't get all hung up about doctrine. They were always about just figuring out how this radical story of love in Jesus Christ makes a difference in our lives. And one day, there was a group as a monastery. They were having trouble. They just were fussing with each other. And Dorotheos was one of those great wise people in the church. And one day it just occurred to him, and they were all outside, and he heard them bickering, and he called them all over, and he drew a big circle on the ground. And then he put a hub at the center. And he said, we are like out here on the outside, on the edge of this circle, and God is at the center. And the only way we travel from the outside to the inside is as a spoke. And he begins drawing spokes from the rim to the hub. And it begins to look like you'd think of a wagon wheel. And as you see this big wagon wheel that's drawn, he says, now, as we draw closer to God, and then just imagine yourself being on one of those spokes, can you get closer to God without getting closer to one another? Or can you move further away from others without moving further away from God? He says that they're intricately connected. If you're having a time working it out with others, you're having a time working it out with God, he said. Or if you are drawn closer to God, then it's going to be something that's going to draw you closer to one another. All their fussing seemed to go away because none of them wanted to be the one who was pushing them further away from God. They wanted to be the ones who were drawing themselves closer to God. We need to have relationships that build us up, not ones that tear us down. And then when we move through all of those, ultimately it's about receptivity and reality. Let's move to that next image. That when we are open to God in our lives, we see that we are like the receptive soil, the soil that finally the lucky ones are planted in. Everywhere and everything is in their favor, and they produce a harvest that far exceeds any expectation, a harvest that multiplies what initially had been given. It's whenever you have the soil that's been prepared, whenever you have the right timing of the planting, when the rains arrive at the right time, and the weeds have been pulled out and taken care of, that's when you have the rich crop. And it takes a lot of things lining up to make that happen. But ultimately, it never happens if God is not out there planting the seed. And remember, we have a generous God who scatters seed in a way that seems crazy to any honest farmer. I mean, would you scatter your seed on the highway? And yet God seems to be scattering seed there, just hoping there might be some way that it catches on and it finds a place to grow. God would rather scatter seed everywhere and have a lot of it not produce than be so stingy holding it back so that that you never waste any seed in unprofitable soil. I think that's one of the things that God can never be accused of, is being stingy on planting seed in our lives. Sometimes we may not be very receptive to growing it, but God is constantly planting new seeds of faith in your life. And if you're open, you'll find a place to allow it to grow. Sometimes we've chosen to be on a different path. Sometimes we found a way to kind of choose a very different direction. I remember a counselor saying that most of the time they spend with people in counseling comes eventually down to the moment of saying, now that I've done all the things that I shouldn't have, how can I avoid the consequences I knew would happen but denied and just hoped would not come around? Sometimes that's the case. We want to just pretend like we don't have to do the things we need to do to let our spiritual life grow, that we can do whatever it is we want, follow whatever path we want, and yet not all of those lead to fruitful spiritual lives. You might remember the African Queen, the movie with Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn. Came down to a place where, he was a drunk. He was always drinking, and she was always on him. She was a missionary about getting his life on the right track as they were traveling up the river in Africa. And it came finally to a place where she says to him that, he says, that he's having trouble just getting beyond his nature. And she says, we were put on this earth to rise above our nature. To rise above our nature. I think she's got it half right. Half of it is to rise above our sinful nature. But I think maybe it is to live into our full nature of who God created us originally to be. That God, before our sin, before our fallenness, God had original intent for who we were to be and what our life was to be like. And we have fallen. We have been like the seed scattered in so many places that wouldn't grow. And into our lives comes an opportunity through Christ that we are opened up again and our life put on the path that we were originally intended to be before we found a way to mess it up in our lives. God's calling us back to that path. The thing is, I've been every one of those types of soil at one time or another. I suspect you have as well. In fact, I can be that every type of soil in the course of one day. And there are places where God is able to plant and help something to grow spiritually in my life, and places where I'm not open. And I need to find ways to open that part of my life to God. Maybe each of us is like the whole of all the places where the seed is planted. And it's about nurturing the soil enough to give enough soil strength to sustain a full crop throughout. One of the teachings I learned early on about gardening is that if you feed the soil will feed you. If you take the rocky ground and you begin to take some of the rock out and you put nutrient into it, even in places like that, you'll find that crops can grow. Some of us have a little rockier soil in our soul than others. Some of us need a little tending, need a little more work of the gardener to create a little more fertile soil in our lives. So that it's not about giving up on bad soil. That's not the point of the parable at all. The point of the parable is letting our lives be rich and open to be fruitful and productive. There we will find that roots will be planted that make a difference. There we will find rituals that aren't just boring, but open us up to God's presence. There we will find relationships that give us energy and move us forward in our lives. When we are open and receptive, roots sink deep, getting the nutrients from the soil. The rituals give direction and set our feet on the right path, and our relationships support through sharing and growth. And when we find that place, finally, our hearts will be able to grow. Our hearts will be able to grow in miraculous results, even 160 and 30 times whatever has been planted. Amen.